Old or bankrupt? The end of Ridge Hollow Ranch was pre-written until she arrived. A 27-year-old woman stepped off a dusty train, suitcase in hand, her eyes fixed on the land the whole region had given up on. No one believed her. The rancher was skeptical. The villagers scoffed. But Harper Bennett didn't come to be welcomed. She came to find the truth others dared not face. And that truth, when revealed, would shake the entire county. Like, subscribe to the channel, and comment the name of the city you're watching from so I know how far this story has come. Now, let's begin. The bus dropped her off at the edge of a gravel turnout that barely qualified as a stop, and Harper Bennett stood there in the August heat watching it pull away with a kind of finality that made her stomach tighten. The road ahead was unpaved, pale with dust, cutting through a landscape that had clearly been losing an argument with drought for several years running. Scrub grass, cracked clay, fence posts leaning at angles that suggested they'd given up on standing straight. She picked up her bag, one large rolling suitcase, one canvas duffel, and a hard-sided case that held her testing equipment, and started walking. The drive from the bus stop to Ridge Hollow Ranch was supposed to be 4 miles. She'd confirmed that twice before leaving. What she hadn't confirmed was whether anyone would be at the gate to meet her, and as she came around the first long bend in the road and saw the rusted iron gate standing open at a permanent tilt, one hinge visibly broken, she had a fairly clear answer. Nobody had come to meet her. She checked her phone. No signal, which didn't surprise her, and kept walking. Harper had taken this job under circumstances that her former colleagues at the agricultural consulting firm in Denver would have called, with various degrees of diplomacy, a mistake. The firm itself had been cautious. Her supervisor, a careful man named Douglas who wore the same 3 ties on rotation and spoke in measured sentences, had pulled up the Ridge Hollow file and spent a long moment looking at it before saying anything. "The Mercer account," he'd said finally. "I know. The bank has already sent 2 assessment teams. Neither of them recommended continuation. I read their reports. They were thorough reports, Harper. They were surface reports," she'd said. "Neither one of them soil tested beyond the first 6 inches. Neither one pulled the water records going back more than 2 years. They looked at the ranch the way you'd look at a sick man and say he's pale and thin and call that a diagnosis." Douglas had looked at her over his reading glasses for a long moment. "The Mercer family has owned that land for 3 generations. The current owner, Cole Mercer, he's behind on 4 separate loan instruments. The primary lender is already in preliminary foreclosure conversations." "I know. This is not a turnaround opportunity, Harper. This is an exit assessment. We document the decline, we confirm the numbers, and the bank uses our report to justify the foreclosure." "Then I'll document what I find," she'd said. She got the assignment. What she hadn't told Douglas was that she'd already spent 11 evenings in the 2 weeks prior reading everything she could find on Ridge Hollow Ranch. Tax records accessible through the county clerk's public database, aerial surveys from the state agricultural office, a water rights filing from 1987 that had annotations she couldn't quite parse without the original, historical cattle census data through the state livestock board. She'd built a rough picture, and the picture had bothered her in a way she couldn't entirely articulate yet. It was the kind of bother that lived at the back of the mind and wouldn't let go, like a word you can't quite remember, but know is there. The ranch came into view around the second bend. It was bigger than she'd expected, which was the first thing that surprised her. The main structure, the house, really a ranch house with additions bolted on over decades, sat on a slight rise with a long front porch, a barn to the east, 2 smaller outbuildings she'd have to identify, and the remains of what looked like a third structure that had partially collapsed. A windmill stood to the north, motionless in the still air. 3 trucks were parked in a loose cluster near the barn, 2 of them visibly not operational. And standing on the porch, arms crossed, watching her come up the road with an expression that she could only describe as resigned suspicion, was a man she assumed was Cole Mercer. He was taller than she'd expected from the file photo. The county tax record had attached a grainy image that hadn't conveyed much. He had the look of someone who had once been broader, who had been slowly worn down from the outside in. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A jaw that needed attention. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and jeans that had been washed too many times, and he watched her cross the yard without moving to help with her bags or come down from the porch. "You're the consultant," he said when she reached the steps. "Harper Bennett." She shifted the equipment case to her left hand and put out her right. He looked at her hand for a moment, then shook it. His grip was automatic, the way people shake hands when they're doing it because manners require it and not because they want to. "Cole Mercer." "I know." He looked at her bags. "You planning on staying long?" "That depends on what I find." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "The last 2 teams sent by the bank stayed about 4 days combined. Showed up, poked around, left." "You bringing better news than they did?" "I'm not bringing news," Harper said. "I'm bringing questions." He seemed to think about that. "You want to come inside, or you want to stand in the yard?" "I'd like to start with the barn, actually, if you don't mind. I want to look at the cattle before the light changes." That surprised him. She could see it in the slight shift of his posture. "Most people want coffee first." "I'll have coffee after." She looked toward the barn. "How many head do you have right now?" 43. He paused. "Down from 208 6 years ago." She held his gaze. "Then we should probably look at the cattle," said. The barn was in better condition than the exterior of the ranch had suggested, which Harper noted and filed away. Someone had been maintaining it, not perfectly, but consistently. The floor had been swept within the past day or 2. Feed bins were organized. Tack hung in order on one wall. Whatever else had fallen apart at Ridge Hollow, the barn itself told a story of someone who still cared, who was still showing up every morning and doing the work even when the work felt pointless. The cattle were another matter. Harper moved through the stalls slowly, crouching when she needed to, running her hand along flanks, checking eyes, looking at hooves and mouths. Cole followed a few paces back, quiet, watching her with the wariness of a man who had learned not to trust assessments. "These animals are underfed," she said, not accusingly, just naming it. "Pasture's been depleted. I've been supplementing with feed, but—" Stopped. "But feed's expensive." "Everything's expensive." She looked at a yearling in the far stall. The animal was thin in a particular way, not just lean, but showing a quality of fatigue in the coat that went beyond caloric deficit. She made a note in the small notebook she'd pulled from her jacket pocket. "What's your water source?" she asked. 3 sources. Crow Creek runs along the north fence. There's a stock pond at the back of the east pasture, and there's a well for the house and near barn operations." "When did you last test the creek water?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't think I have. Not formally." "The stock pond?" "Same." She wrote something down. He was watching her write, and she could feel the tension in him. The particular kind of tension that comes not from hostility, but from dread. The dread of someone waiting for the verdict he's been expecting and doesn't want to hear, made official. "The previous assessment teams," she said without looking up from the notebook. "What did they tell you?" "The first one said the land was overgrazed and the cattle herd was too large for the available forage. They recommended reducing the herd, which I did, though not as much as they said. The second one was more direct, said the operation was non-viable and I should consider voluntary surrender of the property." "Did they give you a specific reason for the decline? A root cause?" Cole leaned against a stall post. "They said it was mismanagement." He said the word flatly, without inflection, but Harper heard what was underneath it. The accumulation of that word. How many times a person could hear that they'd failed, that it was their fault, before it started to shape the way they thought about themselves. "What do you think the root cause is?" she asked. The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Nobody's asked me that." "I'm asking." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I think I made mistakes. I know I made mistakes, but—" He stopped again. "But? Some of this doesn't feel like my mistakes. Some of it feels like something else. I just can't—" He shook his head. "I can't prove that. And I can't say it without sounding like a man who's looking for someone to blame." Harper looked at him steadily. "You're not a man who's looking for someone to blame. You're a man who's been living inside this situation for 6 years and has accumulated observations that don't fit the official story." She paused. "That's actually useful to me." He looked at her for a moment. You're different from the other two teams. Probably, she said. Can you show me the east pasture? Walk. They walked the property until the light started going amber and low, which in August in that part of the country meant they had about 2 hours before actual dark. Harper walked the east pasture with a soil probe, taking samples at intervals she marked on a hand-drawn grid she was building in her notebook. She pulled water from the stock pond with a collection kit and labeled the samples. She walked the north fence line along Crow Creek and crouched at the bank, examining the water, smelling it, taking samples there too. Cole walked beside her, mostly quiet, answering questions when she asked them and not filling the silence when she didn't. The questions she asked were not the ones he'd expected. She didn't ask him about debt or decisions or the choices he'd made in expanding or contracting the herd. She asked him about the timeline of specific events. When had the creekside pasture started to show the first signs of forage decline? What came first? The cattle health issues or the pasture issues? When had he first noticed the particular kind of scrubbiness in the grass at the south edge of the east field? He answered carefully, reaching back through years of memory with the effort of someone who had tried hard to forget. The south edge went first, he said at one point, standing at the corner of the east pasture with the evening light coming level across the dried grass. I remember because I thought it was just the exposure. South-facing, gets more direct sun, dries out faster. But then it spread north, and it didn't spread the way drought usually spreads. Drought spreads from the edges in. This spread from... He stopped, looking at the ground. From the middle, Harper said. He looked at her. How did you know that? I don't know it yet. I'm asking if that's what you're describing. Yeah, he said slowly. It spread from the middle. He paused. That's not how drought works, is it? No, she said. It isn't. She wrote in her notebook. He watched her write. What does it mean? He asked. I'm not sure yet, but it means something. Dinner that evening was a practical and not particularly comfortable affair. Cole cooked. Fried eggs, quisks, canned beans, toast that was more bread than toast, and Harper sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, entering the day's notes into her working document while he moved around the small kitchen. The house had the feeling of a place where someone had been living alone for a long time and had stopped making adjustments for the presence of other people. You don't have to feed me, she said, not looking up from the laptop. You've been walking since noon. He set a plate next to her computer. Eat. She ate. The eggs were plain and the beans were plain, and she was hungrier than she'd realized. You grew up here? She asked. Yeah. He sat across from her with his own plate. Third generation. My grandfather homesteaded the original parcel. My father built it up. I inherited it about 8 years ago when he died. And the trouble started about a year after that. Maybe 14 months. He moved food around his plate. It didn't start fast. It started slow. A bad season, I could explain. Then another one. Cattle getting sick. I brought in vets, changed feed suppliers, changed the supplements. Nothing worked the way it should have. Pasture declining. I rotated grazing, rested fields, brought in a soil consultant. He paused. A different firm. Not yours. What did they recommend? They recommended a soil amendment program. Lime application, phosphorus, the whole protocol. Cost me a significant amount of money. He looked at the table. Didn't help much. Did they take soil samples? They did. Do you have those results? He looked up. I have every piece of paper from the last 8 years in a filing cabinet in the back room. I kept everything. Partly because I didn't know what would matter, and partly because... He stopped. Because? Because I wanted to be able to show someone that I hadn't just thrown up my hands. Harper looked at him. I'd like to go through that filing cabinet. Tonight? Tonight, if you're willing. He studied her for a moment. You're not like the other two teams, he said again. You said that. I know, I'm just... He shook his head. The last person from your industry who came out here told me I should start thinking about what I wanted to keep from the house when the bank took it. Told me it like he was doing me a favor, giving me a head start. He pushed his plate back slightly. I'm not used to someone who wants to look at the filing cabinet. Harper closed her laptop partway. Mr. Mercer. Cole. Cole. I'm not here to deliver a verdict that's already been written. Whatever I find, I find. If the assessment teams before me were right and this ranch is genuinely non-viable due to mismanagement or irreversible land degradation, I'll document that honestly and completely. She paused. But I don't start with a conclusion. I start with data. And the data I've seen today, not all of it, not even close, has already given me 4 things that don't fit the official explanation. He went still. What 4 things? The spread pattern of the forage decline, inside out rather than edge in. The condition of those cattle, which shows a fatigue pattern inconsistent with just dietary deficit. The water from Crow Creek, which has a smell that concerns me and which I need to test before I say more. And one other thing. What's the 4th? The soil samples the previous consultant took. If they ran a standard amendment protocol and it didn't work, and if their soil analysis was accurate, the amendment should have made some measurable difference, even a partial improvement. The fact that it didn't work at all suggests one of 2 things. Either the soil analysis was wrong, or something is actively countering the soil chemistry. Cole stared at her. Something like what? Something like contamination. The words sat between them for a moment. You think the water's contaminated, he said. I think the water might be. I need the test results to say anything definitive, but yes, that's one of the things I'm looking at. He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful and low. If the water's contaminated, that's not... He stopped, started again. That's not something that just happens. That's not bad luck. No, Harper said. It isn't. What? The filing cabinet was a 4-drawer metal unit, battleship gray, slightly rusted at the bottom from a water leak that had since been fixed. It stood in a small room off the main hallway that Cole used partly as an office and partly as storage, and it was, as he'd said, full. Not disorganized. That was the second thing that surprised her, the first being the barn's condition. The files were labeled, the documents were roughly chronological within each folder, and whoever had kept them, Cole, she assumed, had made genuine efforts to retain everything. She started with the oldest material and worked forward. Cole brought her a second cup of coffee around 9 and stood in the doorway watching her work. She'd spread files across the desk and was cross-referencing documents, occasionally making marks in her notebook. What are you looking for? He asked. I'm not sure yet. She held up a folder. This is the original land survey from when you inherited. Who commissioned it? He came in and looked at it. I didn't. I found that in my father's papers. It was done about a year before he died. Who's the surveying firm? He looked at the header on the document. Grayson Land Services. Do you know them? I know the name Grayson. Victor Grayson he's a financier. He does land deals, rural property investment. He's been in this county for as long as I can remember. Cole frowned. I didn't know he had a surveying operation. He does, Harper said. She turned the survey to face Cole and pointed at a line near the bottom. This survey includes a water rights notation. It says the water rights for the North Creek access are subject to prior claims and flags them as potentially restricted. She looked up. Did you know about that? Cole stared at the document. No, I didn't know about that. This survey was done apparently before your father died and before you inherited the property. Did your father mention it to you? My father was sick in his last year. We didn't talk about ranch business the way we had. I didn't know this existed until I found it in the files. He paused. What does subject to prior claims mean practically? It means someone may have documented a claim on the water rights to Crow Creek before your ownership was established. If that claim is legitimate and registered, it could restrict your access. She paused. It could also mean someone created a paper record of a questionable claim in order to cloud your water rights and create future leverage. Cole was very still. You're saying someone might have, manufactured a claim? I'm saying the notation exists and I want to trace it. I need to pull the county water rights records and see what's actually registered. She set the survey down. This might be nothing. It might be standard cautious language in a survey report, but I want to check. He looked at the document for a long moment. Victor Grayson, he said. His voice had taken on a different quality. Do you have a history with him? He offered to buy this ranch about 2 years ago. Low offer, much lower than the land value, even then. I said no. Cole looked at her. He said I'd regret it. He said the land was going to keep declining and I'd end up having to take whatever I could get. He was quiet. I thought he was a man who liked being right about things. Being pessimistic about your situation isn't the same as, no, Harper said. It isn't. She filed the survey separately from the others at the front of her stack. She worked until after midnight. Cole fell asleep in the chair at some point. She heard his breathing change and glanced over to see him out, head tilted back, looking in sleep like a version of himself that the daylight didn't permit. Worn out. Younger in the face somehow. She turned back to the files and kept reading. By the time she closed the last folder and stretched her back and shoulders, she had 7 pages of notes and a number of questions that were starting to arrange themselves into something that felt more like a shape than a suspicion. The soil amendment protocol from the previous consultant, the one that had cost Cole a significant amount and hadn't worked, used a formula she recognized. She'd used it herself, or recommended it, in 3 or 4 similar situations. It was a sound protocol for the soil chemistry described in that consultant's report. The problem was that the soil chemistry described in that report was inconsistent with the samples she'd taken today. The previous readings showed moderate depletion with specific nutrient deficiencies. Her samples today showed something different, contamination markers that, if they'd been present 2 years ago when that consultant sampled, should have shown up in their analysis, which meant either the contamination was recent or the previous consultant's report wasn't accurate. She put that in her notes with 2 lines under it. The water rights notation on the Grayson survey would require a county records check she couldn't do tonight. She made a note of the tracking numbers on the document. The cattle supplier receipts in the back of the 3rd drawer were the last thing she'd gotten to, and they'd stopped her cold. Cole had changed suppliers twice in the past 4 years, once after the herd started showing health problems, and once again after the second supplier hadn't improved things. Both suppliers were names she didn't recognize, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that when she'd gone looking for those names in the state livestock board records, using the registration numbers from the receipts, she'd found that the first supplier had been flagged, not prominently, not with any formal action, but flagged in a complaint report filed by another rancher in an adjacent county. The complaint was about cattle sold with falsified health certifications. She stared at that for a while. Falsified health certifications meant sick cattle sold as healthy cattle. Sick cattle introduced to a herd created cascading health problems that could look, from the outside, like mismanagement, like a rancher who didn't know how to maintain his animals. She wrote it down. She put a star next to it. Then she gathered her notes, capped her pen, and sat quietly for a moment in the small cluttered room with the filing cabinet and the sleeping man in the chair and the particular stillness of a ranch at night, all the land around it dark and quiet and holding its secrets. She wasn't ready to say out loud what she thought she was seeing, but she thought she was seeing something. The next morning, she was up before Cole, which she suspected wasn't something that happened often, and she was out by the stock pond by the time the sky had gone from black to that particular bruised purple that precedes actual dawn. She had a flashlight, and her notebook and her boots were wet by the time the light had improved enough to work by. The stock pond was smaller than she'd expected, maybe 3/4 of an acre, irregularly shaped, fed by a combination of runoff and what she suspected was a seep from a subsurface source. The water was greenish in a way that could mean algae or could mean other things. The edges had a particular crystallized quality where the waterline had dropped over the summer, the kind of residue that could be mineral deposit or could be something else. She took 4 samples from different locations in the pond, labeled them carefully, and added them to the samples from the creek. She walked the south fence line and then the west, looking at the soil, looking at the plants, making notes. The degradation pattern she'd described to Cole the evening before, the inside-out spread, was clearer in the morning light. It came from 2 points in the east pasture and spread outward from each, overlapping in the middle. She marked both points on her grid. Cole found her there around 6:30, walking up in boots and a jacket with 2 travel mugs of coffee, still looking like someone who hadn't slept quite enough. "You're up early," he said, handing her a mug. "I'm always up early." She accepted the coffee gratefully. "I've been looking at the degradation spread." He stopped beside her and looked out at the pasture. In the morning light, the pattern was visible. The dead and struggling grass in rough, irregular shapes radiating from 2 points like rings from stones dropped in still water. "I never noticed that pattern," he said slowly. "You've been looking at it as a landscape problem, a whole pasture issue." She pointed at the 2 source points. "Those 2 locations. What's in the ground there, if anything? Infrastructure, old buried lines, anything like that?" He was quiet for a moment. "There's a drainage tile system, installed, I want to say 20 years ago. My father put it in to help manage the wet season. There are 2 main junction points in the east pasture." He stopped. "I don't know exactly where." "I'd like to find them," Harper said. He looked at her. The morning light was flat and honest, and it showed the tiredness in his face, but also something else that hadn't been there the day before, a quality of alertness, of someone who had been half asleep for years and was starting to come awake. "You think something's wrong with the drainage," he said. "I think if someone wanted to introduce a contaminant to a specific area of land, reliably, at depth, with minimal surface evidence, the existing drainage tile system would be one way to do it." The words landed in the cold morning air and stayed there. Cole set his coffee mug down on a fence post. He didn't say anything for a long time. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the grass, the sound carrying far and clear in the still air. "That would mean," he said finally, "that someone has been on my land, deliberately, more than once." "It would mean that, if that's what the evidence shows." She looked at him. "I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying it's a possibility I need to investigate." "Victor Grayson," he said. Not a question. "I don't know yet. I don't have anything that connects a name to what I'm describing. I have a pattern in the soil that needs an explanation, and I have a survey document with a questionable water rights notation, and I have a cattle supplier with a fraud flag on their record." She paused. "That's not proof of anything yet. That's a collection of questions." Cole picked up his coffee mug. He looked at the pasture for a moment longer, then at her. "What do you need?" he asked. "I need to get to the county records office," she said. "And I need to find those drainage tile junction points. And I need to call a colleague of mine who specializes in contaminant analysis and get these water samples into a proper lab." "The county records office opens at 8:30, he said. "It's in Dalhart, 40-minute drive." "Do you have a map of the original drainage tile installation? Any kind of documentation?" "I don't know. There might be something in the barn with the old equipment records." He was already moving toward the barn. "I'll look." Harper watched him go. The long-strided, purposeful walk of a man who'd been given something to do, something that felt like more than treadwater survival. And she stood in the east pasture with her coffee and her notebooks, and the early sun just clearing the flat horizon, and tried to hold what she knew carefully, without letting it run ahead of itself. Something had happened to this ranch, something deliberate. She wasn't certain yet, and she wouldn't say what she wasn't certain of. But the evidence was starting to speak in a direction, and the direction was not mismanagement. The direction was toward a choice someone had made, a choice to take something that wasn't theirs. She opened her notebook to a fresh page, wrote the date at the top, and began making a list of everything she still needed to find. The drainage tile map turned up in the back of a wooden crate under the workbench in the barn, folded into quarters and tucked inside a rusted coffee can, along with a handful of fence staples and a broken pocket knife. Cole brought it out into the morning light and unfolded it carefully, the paper soft at the creases from years of moisture, and they spread it across the hood of the one truck that still ran and weighted the corners with a wrench and 2 coffee mugs. It was hand-drawn, done by someone with drafting skill. Cole's father, he said, who had been methodical about documentation in the way that men of that generation sometimes were, as if they understood that paper outlasted memory. The east pasture tile system was laid out clearly, with measurements and compass bearings and 2 junction points marked with small X's. Harper looked at the map, then looked at the pasture, orienting herself. "The first junction is about 40 yards northeast of the gate," she said. "The second is—" She traced the line with her finger. "Near the center, maybe 60 yards further east." That's consistent with what I remember, Cole said. My father had them put in to drain the low spots. The center of the east pasture used to flood in heavy rain years. It doesn't flood now. No, it doesn't. He said it without inflection, but the implication was there. Harper refolded the map and put it in her jacket pocket. I want to dig at both junction points. Not deep, just enough to inspect the tile condition and look for any modifications. Cole looked at her. Modifications. Access points. Anything that shouldn't be there. He nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when they understand what you're saying and aren't sure they want it to be true. I'll get the shovels. They drove to Dalhart first because the county records office had hours and the drainage tile didn't. Harper sat in the passenger seat of Cole's truck, the one that ran, a battered F250 that smelled of diesel and old coffee, with her notebook open and her list of document numbers from the Grayson survey. Cole drove without talking much, which she was coming to understand was his default. He spoke when he had something to say and went quiet when he didn't, and the quiet wasn't uncomfortable, just occupied. She used the drive to organize her notes into categories: water, soil, cattle, financial, survey. Under each category, she wrote what she had and what she needed. The cattle supplier flag was the one she kept coming back to. A falsified health certification complaint didn't become public knowledge easily. Someone had filed that complaint with the state livestock board, and she needed to know who and what had come of it. The rancher who filed the complaint against the cattle supplier, she said. Do you know anyone in the county to the east who's had similar problems? Herd health declines, land degradation, financial distress? Cole thought about it. Jim Pardee, he's about 40 miles east toward the state line. He sold out 2 years ago. Or he was forced to sell, depending on who you talk to. Bank foreclosure. He paused. He was in better shape than me 5 years ago. He had a solid operation. Who bought his property? A pause. I don't know exactly. It went through some kind of landholding company. Another pause, longer. Victor Grayson has an interest in a holding company. I don't know if it's the same one. Harper wrote down Jim Pardee's name. The county records office was a single-story building attached to the county courthouse, staffed by 2 women who had clearly been there for decades and maintained the files with the proprietary care of people who considered them a personal responsibility. Harper presented her consulting credentials and the document numbers, and one of the women, her nameplate said Doris, went into the back without comment and returned 15 minutes later with a folder. The water rights filing was real. It had been registered 11 years ago, before Cole's father died, under a name that wasn't Grayson's directly, but which Harper recognized as a possible shell, RHL Land Holdings, registered in the county clerk's index with a post office box address and a filing agent whose name she didn't know. Can I get the registration documents for RHL Land Holdings? She asked Doris. That's a different index. Doris looked at her over reading glasses. It'll take a few minutes. I'll wait. Cole stood near the door with his hat in his hands, watching her. When she glanced at him, he raised his eyebrows slightly. She gave a small shake of her head. Not yet. RHL Land Holdings had been registered with minimal documentation, the kind of registration that existed primarily to create a legal entity capable of filing claims without a visible human name attached to it. The filing agent was a law office in Amarillo. The water rights claim it had registered was for a historical use right on Crow Creek, predating Cole's father's ownership, which on its face might have been legitimate. Historical water rights in that part of the country were complicated and contested. But the timing of the registration, 3 years before Cole inherited, was suggestive. If this water rights claim is valid, Harper said to Doris, keeping her voice neutral, does it restrict downstream access? Doris looked at the document. A prior use claim of this type, if it's valid and registered, can limit downstream withdrawals during drought conditions. She looked over her glasses again. Has there been enforcement action on this? Not that I know of, Cole said from near the door. Then it may just be sitting on the record. Doris looked at the folder. But it's there. That's enough to affect a property assessment. Harper thanked her and photographed the documents with her phone before they left. In the truck, driving back, Cole was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was flat and careful. So someone registered a water rights claim on the creek before I inherited the property. Someone connected to Grayson. Possibly connected. I haven't established that directly. But if that claim exists on the record, any bank assessing the ranch would flag it. Yes. Which means any lender looking at this property as collateral would see a water rights dispute as a liability. Yes. Which makes the loans harder, which makes the terms worse. Cole, I'm not jumping to conclusions, he said. I'm just following the logic. She let him follow it. He was right about the logic. They found the first drainage tile junction point in the early afternoon, marked on the old map and located with a combination of measurement and the slight depression in the ground that Cole knew to look for. Once Harper explained what she was looking for, he dug efficiently, without wasted motion, and Harper crouched at the edge of the hole as the tile came visible at about 18 inches depth. The tile itself was clay, original installation, aged but intact. The junction cap was concrete, standard construction for the era, and sitting beside the junction cap, inserted through a hand-cut opening in the tile wall that had been roughly sealed with hydraulic cement that was visibly newer than the surrounding material, was a small-diameter plastic tube running vertically upward into the soil above. Cole stopped digging when he saw it. He looked at the tube. He looked at Harper. "That's not original," he said. "No," she said. "It isn't." She photographed it from 4 angles before touching anything. Then she took a soil sample from directly around the insertion point, bagging and labeling it separately from her earlier samples. She examined the hydraulic cement seal. It was workmanlike, the kind of job someone competent but not expert had done, and it had been there long enough to cure fully, but not long enough to have developed the weathering of the surrounding concrete. 2 years, maybe 3, maybe less. "The tube runs up to the surface," she said. "If it's open at the top end, something could be introduced through it and carried into the drainage tile system. And the drainage tile system connects to the stock pond," Cole said. His voice had gone very quiet. "The tile outlets into the stock pond." She looked at him. He was looking at this tube with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the dull resignation she'd learned to read in his face, but something more acute. Something that was working its way toward anger from a long distance. "I want to find the second junction," she said. The second one had the same modification. Different tube, slightly larger diameter, same hydraulic cement, same relative freshness. This one had a small residue at the tube opening that Harper photographed and scraped carefully into a sample container. She stood up and looked at the east pasture and at the stock pond visible in the middle distance, and at the 2 depression points in the grass that she now understood differently than she had this morning. "Someone has been treating your drainage system as a delivery mechanism," she said. "Whatever went through these tubes went into the tile system, came out at the stock pond, and spread through the soil as the tile leaked, which old clay tile always does. The spread pattern we saw this morning." She paused. "The inside-out degradation. It came from these 2 points." Cole was standing at the edge of the second hole with his shovel in his hand and his jaw tight. "My cattle have been drinking from that pond," he said. "Yes." "For years." "Yes." He didn't say anything else for a moment. The wind came across the pasture, warm and dry, carrying the smell of dust and dead grass. "How do I fix it?" he asked. "First, I need to know exactly what was introduced. The lab results will tell me that. Once I know what it is, we can design a remediation protocol. Soil remediation, water remediation." She paused. "And I need to isolate your cattle from the stock pond immediately. Move them to the creek water only on the north side until I can test the creek as well. And if the creek tests come back clean, we use that as the sole water source." The creek water rights claim is unenforceable at this stage. It's a filing, not a court order. You have historical use rights that predate that claim. I'll document that. She looked at him. "But Cole, we need to take the cattle off the contaminated water source today." He planted the shovel in the dirt. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." The call to her lab contact took 3 attempts to connect. Signal out here came and went like weather. And when she finally reached Marcus Webb, a water and soil chemist she'd worked with twice before on agricultural contamination cases, she stood outside the barn in the late afternoon and walked him through what she'd found, starting with the water samples and ending with the modified tile junctions and the residue at the tube opening. Marcus was quiet for a moment when she finished. The residue you scraped, describe the color and texture again. Slightly waxy, dark brownish gray, not much of it. Maybe a tablespoon, dried. It had a faint chemical smell, not organic. And you said the soil around the junction point was showing what kind of surface presentation? Crystallization at the waterline on the stock pond. The soil degradation consistent with pH disruption in both directions. I'm seeing acid and alkaline signatures in different microzones, which doesn't make sense for a natural process. No, it doesn't. Another pause. Harper, if you're describing what I think you're describing, this is a sustained release compound situation. You introduce a formulated chemical agent into the drainage system over a period of months or years, it disperses through the tile system, leaches into the soil and water, and you get exactly the kind of multi-factor degradation you're describing. Cattle health, forage decline, soil chemistry disruption. His voice was measured but not casual. This isn't an accident. I know. You're going to need the lab results before you say that to anyone officially. I know that too. How fast can you process? For a priority run. 3 days. Maybe 4. I need everything you've got. Overnight it to the lab. I'll drive it to Dalhart tonight and ship from there. When she went back inside, Cole was on the phone. She could hear his voice from the kitchen, patient and low, talking to someone about moving the herd to the north pasture near the creek. She went to the back room and sat at the desk with her notes and began building a timeline. She started from the beginning. Cole's father's death. The Grayson survey commissioned and filed in the year before. The water rights claim registered before that. The inheritance. The 14 months of normal operations. Then the first signs. In what season? In what location? In what order? She pulled the filing cabinet records and cross-referenced, noting dates, building the sequence. It was slow work, and it required patience she had to consciously maintain because part of her mind wanted to run ahead of the evidence and reach the conclusion her gut was already approaching. She'd learned over years of this work that the conclusions you reached too fast were the ones that didn't hold. The ones that held were the ones you built carefully, piece by piece, with every gap documented honestly and every assumption labeled as such. Cole came in around 7. He leaned in the doorway looking at the spread of papers across the desk. Herds moved, he said. North pasture. Good. I also called Jim Pardee. She looked up. The rancher who sold out? He wasn't easy to reach. He moved after the foreclosure. He's living with his daughter about 200 miles east. Cole came in and sat down in the chair across from the desk. We talked for about 45 minutes. And? Cole was quiet for a moment, organizing what he was going to say. Jim had the same things happen. Not identical, but close. Cattle health decline that didn't respond to normal treatment. Pasture degradation that spread in a way he couldn't explain. He brought in consultants, same as me. Spent money on treatments that didn't work. He paused. He had a survey done when he was refinancing about 4 years ago. The survey was done by Grayson Land Services. Harper set down her pen. The survey had a notation about his water access, Cole continued. Something about a historical claim on the tributary that ran through his property. He didn't know what to make of it. His banker flagged it as a complication and the loan terms got worse. He looked at the desk. He lost the property 8 months after that survey. Who bought it? He doesn't know exactly. It went through a holding company. He got a letter from something called... Cole pulled out his phone and looked at a note he'd made. Ridgeline Holdings, LLC. Harper opened her laptop and searched the name. The registration was thin, the same kind of minimal entity filing she'd seen for RHL Land Holdings. Different name, same structure. She looked at the filing agent, same law office in Amarillo. She turned the laptop to face Cole. He looked at the screen for a moment, then at her. How many ranches? He said. I don't know yet. But this isn't just me. No, she said. I don't think it is. He sat back in the chair. The overhead light in the small room was a bare bulb, harsh and unforgiving, and it showed every line in his face. He looked older than he had when she'd arrived yesterday. Not because he was tired, though he was, but because something had shifted in his understanding of his own situation, and that shift had weight. 6 years, he said. I spent 6 years thinking I'd failed, that I wasn't, that I didn't have what it took to hold on to something my grandfather built. He stopped. I changed the way I talked about myself, the way I thought about myself. Harper didn't say anything. She let him sit in it. And it was manufactured, he said. Someone manufactured my failure. That's what the evidence is starting to suggest, she said carefully. I need the lab results. I need to trace the holding companies further. I need to find out how many properties have gone through this same pattern. She paused. But yes, that's where this is pointing. Cole was quiet for a long time. Okay, he said finally. His voice was different from how it had been yesterday. Not harder exactly, but more solid. More like something that had decided it was done being eroded. What do we do next? Tomorrow, Harper said, I want to pull samples from the creek north of the property boundary. If the contamination was introduced upstream, we might find trace evidence. And I want to photograph both tile junctions fully before we do anything else. She paused. And I need to call my supervisor and tell him this assessment has changed scope. Cole raised his eyebrows slightly. Changed how? It started as an exit assessment for a failing ranch, she said. It's becoming something else. The lab results came back in 3 days, as Marcus had promised, and they were worse than Harper had expected. She was sitting at the kitchen table when the email arrived, Cole across from her with his second cup of coffee. Both of them having developed over the past several days the kind of morning rhythm that forms between people who are working hard towards something and have stopped pretending they don't depend on each other to get there. She read the report twice before she said anything. Then she turned the laptop to face him. He read it slowly. She watched his face. The stock pond water contained elevated concentrations of a synthetic herbicide compound, not one sold commercially in standard formulations, but a blended variant that Marcus had flagged as consistent with industrial agricultural sabotage in 2 prior cases he'd encountered in his career. The compound was designed to be slow-releasing and to bind to soil particles, which explained why the degradation had been consistent and progressive rather than sudden. It killed root systems gradually, altered soil pH over time, and Marcus had added this in a note at the bottom of the report, was known to cause the specific kind of chronic fatigue and immune suppression in cattle that produce symptoms easily mistaken for nutritional deficiency. The soil samples from the drainage tile junction points confirmed trace concentrations of the same compound in the surrounding earth. Cole set the laptop down. He didn't say anything for a moment. Someone bought this specific compound, Harper said. It isn't available at a farm supply store. It requires either industrial sourcing or a custom formulation from a chemical manufacturer. She paused. That's a paper trail. Can you trace it? Marcus has contacts at the state agriculture department. He's already flagged the compound to their compliance division. She closed the laptop. But Cole, this report, combined with the survey documentation and what Jim Pardee told you, is enough to take to an attorney. Today. He looked at her. What kind of attorney? One who handles agricultural fraud and land rights. I have a name. A woman in Amarillo named Rita Castillo, who has worked on cases like this before. She'd spent 2 hours the previous evening on the phone with former colleagues, pulling every reference she could. She's not cheap, but she's effective. I can't afford... She works on contingency for cases with sufficient evidence of damages. Harper held his gaze. Cole, the evidence is there. The lab results, the modified tile junctions, the fraudulent water rights filing, the pattern across multiple properties. This isn't a struggling rancher looking for someone to blame. This is documented, systematic fraud. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, one of the cattle in the north pasture made a sound that carried faintly through the window, and the windmill that had been still on her first day was turning now. She and Cole had repaired it 2 days ago, replacing a seized bearing that had cost $11.45 of work. Small thing. It had mattered more than it probably should have. Rita Castillo, he said finally. I'll send you her number. He nodded. Then he picked up his coffee and looked out the window at the turning windmill. I feel like I should have found this myself, he said. In 6 years, I should have. You were inside it, Harper said. You can't see the pattern from inside the pattern. That's not a personal failure. That's just how it works. He didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded again. Quote, she called Douglas that morning from the truck, parked on the county road where the signal was strongest, and laid out the full assessment as it stood. He was quiet for longer than she expected when she finished. Harper, he said carefully, what you're describing, this moves well beyond the scope of a standard agricultural assessment. I know. The firm's engagement is with the primary lender. Our report informs the foreclosure process. The foreclosure process is based on a fraudulent decline, she said. If we submit an exit assessment that recommends foreclosure without disclosing the contamination evidence and the fraud pattern, we're contributing to the outcome a criminal enterprise is trying to achieve. Another long silence. You're certain about the lab results? I have a signed report from Marcus Webb. The compound is real, the concentrations are real, and the delivery mechanism is documented. And the other properties. I've identified 2 so far with strong pattern similarity. I believe there are more. She paused. Douglas, this is the right call, and you know it. I need the firm to authorize an expanded scope assessment, and I need it in writing today. She could hear him breathing. She knew Douglas well enough to know he was thinking about liability, about the firm's relationship with the bank, about the clean predictability of the exit assessment they'd sent her to perform. She also knew that Douglas, underneath all the caution, had a functional conscience. I'll have the authorization to you by end of business, he said. Thank you. Harper, be careful. She wasn't sure exactly what he meant by that, but she said she would be and ended the call. She found out what he meant 4 days later. Sessom. The letter arrived at the ranch addressed to Cole, from a law firm in Amarillo. Not Rita Castillo's firm, a different one, larger, with 4 names on the letterhead. It informed Cole Mercer that his engagement of Harper Bennett and her associated consulting firm was under legal challenge on the grounds that her assessment methodology had failed to meet the professional standards required under the State Agricultural Consultant Licensing Board, and that her findings were therefore inadmissible in any financial or legal proceeding related to the Ridge Hollow property. It further stated that a formal complaint had been filed with the licensing board and that a hearing had been requested. Cole handed her the letter across the kitchen table without saying anything. She read it twice. Victor Grayson, she said. Has to be. She set the letter down. Her hands were steady, but something in her chest had gone tight. Not fear exactly, more like the recognition of a threat that was more organized than she'd anticipated. He knows what we have. Or he knows we're looking. Cole leaned back in his chair. How does he know that? It was a good question. She thought about it. The county records office, she said. Doris would have a record of what documents I pulled. If Grayson has a contact there, or if someone noticed the request, she stopped. Or Jim Pardee. If Pardee mentioned to anyone that Cole Mercer had called him asking questions. Cole's jaw tightened. Jim wouldn't, not intentionally. But Pardee lives with his daughter, 200 miles away, and he spent years being made to feel like his failure was his own fault. If he talked about our conversation to someone, a neighbor, an old acquaintance, word travels in small counties. Cole was quiet. Then, what does the licensing complaint mean for you, practically? If the licensing board schedules a hearing and issues a temporary suspension pending review, I can't practice in this state while the suspension is in effect. She said it as flatly as she could. My findings could be challenged on that basis in any legal proceeding. So he's trying to pull you off the case? Yes. Can he do it? She picked up the letter again. The complaint against her methodology. She'd have to read the full filing to know exactly what they were alleging, but she could guess the broad shape of it. Improper sampling protocols, failure to follow licensed assessment procedures, conflict of interest possibly, since she'd gone beyond the original scope of the engagement. These were the kinds of allegations that were hard to disprove quickly and easy to make sound serious. He can try, she said. She called Rita Castillo that afternoon. Castillo had already heard about the licensing complaint. News moved fast in the legal community, apparently, and her response was brisk and direct. They're doing what I expected them to do, Castillo said, which is actually good news in a way. An innocent party doesn't hire a 4-name law firm to file a licensing complaint against an agricultural consultant. That's a response to a threat. A pause. Your lab results are solid. Marcus Webb's report is solid. Webb's credible? Good. And the physical evidence? The tile modifications, the tube insertions, that's documented how? Photographs, soil samples, coordinates. I have everything. Don't touch those junctions again. Leave them exactly as they are. I'm going to want a forensic investigator to document them independently before anything gets disturbed. Another pause. Ms. Bennett, I need to ask you directly. Is there anything in your methodology that could legitimately be challenged? Anything that wasn't by the book? Harper thought about it honestly. My initial sample collection was conducted outside the formal assessment scope, before the expanded authorization came through. Someone could argue I was operating beyond my engagement in those first 2 days. But the expanded authorization is now in writing? Yes. Then we document that the initial observations led to the expanded authorization and that all formal evidentiary collection occurred after that point. Castillo's voice was matter of fact. This is manageable. What isn't manageable is if you stop now. I'm not stopping, Harper said. Good. Because I've been looking at the holding company registrations you sent me. RHL Land Holdings and Ridgeline Holdings LLC share the same filing agent, a lawyer named Cruz at a firm in Amarillo who does a lot of entity formation work for rural land investment vehicles. Cruz isn't Grayson's primary counsel, but there's a documented business relationship. She paused. I think there are more properties. I've started pulling county foreclosure records for the last 8 years within a 200-mile radius. How many? Preliminary count before I verify each one is 11 properties with pattern similarities. I want to be careful about that number. Some may not hold up on closer examination, but if even 6 of them show the same combination of degraded land, fraudulent survey notations, and acquisition by a Grayson-connected entity, that's not a pattern, Harper said. That's a system. Yes, Castillo said. It is. The next week was the hardest stretch of time Harper had spent on a work assignment in her career, and she'd had some difficult ones. The licensing board formally acknowledged the complaint and set a preliminary hearing date 6 weeks out, which meant for now she could continue working, but the clock was running. Grayson's attorneys sent 2 more letters, one to Cole, one to her firm, both variations on the same pressure. Cease the assessment, cooperate with the foreclosure timeline, and the complaint would be quietly withdrawn. Douglas forwarded her the letter to the firm with a single line of text. Your call. She appreciated that more than she could have said. Cole handled the pressure in the way she'd come to expect from him. He got quieter and worked harder. They were in the field most days, moving the herd, managing the remediation protocol she'd designed based on the lab results, repairing the water system infrastructure that years of neglect and deliberate sabotage had degraded. The work was physical, and it was relentless, and there were days when Harper's shoulders ached from fence work she'd never been trained for, and she made mistakes that Cole corrected without comment, just showing her the right way without making her feel small about not knowing it. One evening, after they'd spent 6 hours rerunning pipe to the North Pasture's water trough, they sat on the tailgate of the truck in the last of the daylight with cold water and sandwiches that Cole had made that morning. Harper's hands had blisters she hadn't noticed acquiring. You don't have to do the physical work, Cole said. He was looking at her hands. It goes faster with 2 people. You're a consultant, not a ranch hand. The assessment requires understanding what the remediation actually takes. I can't write an honest recovery plan from a desk. He looked at her for a moment. Is that the real reason? She thought about it. Partly. She looked at the North Pasture, at the cattle near the trough, at the last light going orange and wide across the flat land. Partly I just needed to be doing something with my hands while I think. He accepted that. They ate for a while in silence. Rita called me this afternoon, he said. I know. She told me she was going to. She's found 4 ranchers who are willing to talk to her. People who went through the same thing and lost their properties. He paused. One of them is a woman named Dolores Hatch. She's 71. She and her husband built their ranch for 40 years and lost it in 14 months. He stopped again. Her husband died 6 months after the foreclosure. Harper looked at her hands. She wants to testify, Cole said. Rita says she's... He searched for the word. Determined. Good. The 4 of them together, plus me, plus Jim Pardee, that's 6 properties, 6 documented patterns. He was quiet. Rita thinks there may be more who don't know yet that what happened to them wasn't their fault. Harper set down her sandwich. The blisters on her hands stung. That's why we need to make sure the hearing goes the right way. If Grayson's legal team succeeds in getting my findings excluded, they won't, Cole said. She looked at him. It wasn't the words that struck her. It was the certainty in them, not false confidence, not bravado. Something that had settled in him over the past week, a quality of resolution that came from the outside in, starting at the surface and working its way through. You've changed your mind about this, she said. I believed my grandfather when he told me that land was worth fighting for. He looked at the pasture. I stopped believing that for a while. Stopped believing I was worth fighting for. He paused. I've changed my mind about that too. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful she could add to that. The moment she understood the full scope of what Grayson had built came on a Thursday morning, 10 days after the lab results arrived, when Castillo called with her voice carrying a different kind of energy than usual. I have a source, Castillo said. Someone who worked in Grayson's land operations for 4 years. They want to talk, but not on record yet. I need you to listen to what they've described and tell me if it matches your technical findings. Okay. Grayson's operation ran like this. He identified target properties, high land value, struggling owners, ideally 2nd or 3rd generation, who had emotional stakes and limited financial sophistication. He commissioned surveys through his own surveying company that included water rights notations designed to cloud the property titles. He then directed owners to specific cattle suppliers he had a financial relationship with, who provided livestock with compromised health certifications. And he arranged, through intermediaries, for the introduction of the chemical compound your lab identified into the property's water and drainage systems. A pause. The introduction was done at night, 2-person crews. The source says it happened over a period of months at each property, enough doses to produce cumulative damage without a single obvious contamination event. Harper was sitting very still. He had crews doing this. According to the source, yes. The source participated in 2 of these operations before understanding what they were actually doing and stopping. Will they testify? That's the question. They're scared. Grayson is not someone who responds passively to threats, and this person knows things that could put Grayson in a serious legal position. Another pause. But they're also carrying a significant amount of guilt. They have a family. They have a conscience that's been working on them for 2 years. Harper thought about Dolores Hatch, 71 years old, who had watched 40 years of her husband's work taken from them in 14 months, and whose husband hadn't lived to see any accounting for it. Tell them, Harper said, that there are 6 families who lost everything, and that if they don't speak, there will probably be more. Castillo was quiet for a moment. I'll pass that along. After the call, Harper sat at the kitchen table with her notes and her timeline and the accumulation of everything she'd built over the past 2 weeks. She could hear Cole outside, the sound of the tractor, the particular mechanical rhythm of someone doing morning feeding. The windmill turned in the morning wind. The cattle in the north pasture were visibly better than they'd been when she arrived. Not recovered, not even close to what they should be, but eating and moving and showing the beginning of something that wasn't decline. She pulled out a fresh page in her notebook and started writing. Not notes this time. A structured summary. The kind of document a court could follow. The timeline, the evidence, the chain of connection between the pieces. She'd learned a long time ago that a case wasn't built from one big revelation. It was built from the careful accumulation of small truths, each one documented, each one connected to the next, until the overall shape became undeniable. The shape here was becoming undeniable. She kept writing. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday, which gave Harper exactly 4 days after Castillo called with the witness confirmation to finish preparing her documentation package and drive to Amarillo. The witness had agreed to testify. His name was Danny Foss, and he was 34 years old, worked now at a grain elevator in a small town 2 counties over, and had spent the better part of 2 years trying to convince himself that what he'd done, what he'd been part of, was something he could live with quietly. He couldn't. His wife had noticed the change in him, the way he'd gone inward and stayed there, and one night in their kitchen he'd told her everything and she'd sat with it for a long time, and then said, with the kind of plain directness that cuts through everything else, that he needed to fix what he could fix. Castillo had spent 6 hours with Foss over 2 sessions, and she called Harper after the second one. "He's credible," she said. "He doesn't oversell it. He doesn't try to minimize his own role. He was hired as a land maintenance contractor, told the work was soil treatment for remediation purposes, and it took him 8 months and 2 properties before he understood what the compound actually did. When he figured it out, he stopped and didn't go back." A pause. "Grayson's people never followed up with him. He thinks they assumed his silence was purchased by the amount they'd paid him for the work." "Was it?" Harper asked, because she needed to know. "For 2 years, yes," Castillo said without judging it. "Not anymore." Harper drove to Amarillo the Sunday before the hearing. Cole drove separately, which she'd expected. He had ranch obligations he couldn't abandon even for this. And she'd learned enough about him by now to know that asking him to leave the animals and the land unattended for longer than necessary would sit wrong with him in a way he wouldn't fully articulate. He pulled into the motel parking lot about 2 hours after she did, and they had dinner at a diner across the street that served food without much distinction but in large quantities. "You've done this before," Cole said. It wasn't quite a question. He was watching her across the table with the particular attention of someone who had been around her long enough to read her moods. "Testified in proceedings, yes. Defended assessments under challenge." She moved food around her plate. "Not at this scale." "What's different about this scale?" She thought about how to say it honestly. "Usually when I defend an assessment, it's me explaining my methodology to people who are skeptical of my conclusions. This time there's an organized legal effort specifically designed to discredit me personally before the content of my findings is even examined." She paused. "And there are people depending on the outcome who have already lost a great deal." Cole looked at his coffee. "Dolores Hatch called me last week." Harper hadn't known that. "What did she say?" "She wanted to know if I thought this was going to work, whether it was worth her making the drive." He turned his cup in his hands. "She's 71. Long drive. Her daughter didn't want her to go alone." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I thought it was worth it." He looked up. "I told her someone had shown me it was worth it." Harper didn't respond to that directly. She looked at the window, at the parking lot outside, at the ordinary Tuesday night traffic on the street beyond. "She should be there," she said. "All of them should be there, if they can manage it." Rita said the same thing. Said a courtroom isn't just about documents. He paused. Said judges are human. "Judges are human," Harper agreed. "That's the best and worst thing about them." The hearing was in a civil court annex, a room that felt like it had been designed to reduce everything to its least dramatic form. Fluorescent lighting, wood laminate surfaces, chairs that enforced bad posture. Grayson's attorneys were 2 men and a woman from the firm whose letterhead Harper had memorized over the past several weeks. They were well-dressed and organized, and they moved through the room with the efficiency of people who had done this many times and expected to do it many more. Grayson himself was there. She hadn't seen him in person before, only a photograph Castillo had pulled from a county business directory. He was in his early 60s, compact, with the kind of composed expression that comes from decades of practicing it. He sat at his attorney's table and looked at the room with eyes that moved without much visible emotion, taking inventory. When those eyes reached Harper, they stayed for a moment. She held the look without expression and looked away first, not from discomfort, but because she had other things to do with her attention. Castillo had prepared her thoroughly. The licensing board challenge would be addressed first. Grayson's attorneys would argue that Harper's methodology was non-compliant and her findings therefore inadmissible. Castillo would counter with the methodology documentation, the expanded authorization, and Marcus Webb's independent corroboration. The question the presiding officer needed to answer was whether Harper's assessment met professional standards and whether her findings could stand as the basis for further legal action. "They're going to go after the first 2 days," Castillo had said in the preparatory session the evening before. The sampling you did before the formal expanded scope was authorized. That's their cleanest attack. The samples from those 2 days aren't the foundation of the case, Harper had said. They were observational. The formal evidentiary samples all came after authorization. You need to say that clearly and calmly and not get rattled when they try to make it sound like you were operating rogue. Castillo had looked at her directly. They're going to try to make you seem like someone who went into a situation with a predetermined conclusion and worked backward. The best way to counter that is to walk through your actual process, step by step, and let the logic speak. I can do that. I know you can. A pause. They'll also try to make the contamination evidence seem speculative. Webb's report is solid, but they'll argue alternative explanations. Natural mineral contamination, adjacent agricultural operations, historical industrial use. You need to explain why those alternatives don't fit the data. They don't fit the spread pattern, Harper had said. They don't fit the compound identification. And they don't fit the physical evidence of the modified drainage junctions. Each alternative explanation might account for one element. None of them account for all three simultaneously. Castillo had nodded. Say exactly that. The hearing ran for most of the day. Grayson's attorneys were skillful. She'd give them that. They asked questions that were technically reasonable and framed in ways designed to make her qualifications seem marginal and her process seem improvised. The first attorney, a man named Carver, who had a specific gift for making sincerity sound like arrogance, spent 40 minutes walking through her first 2 days at the ranch and asking why she had conducted testing before formal authorization. I was conducting preliminary observational work, Harper said. Standard practice in any assessment is to observe before you sample. What I saw in the first 2 days, the soil presentation, the water appearance, the cattle condition, the physical evidence at the drainage junctions, gave me grounds to request an expanded scope authorization from my firm, which I received in writing before any formal evidence collection began. But you had already drawn conclusions before that authorization, Carver said. I had formed hypotheses, she said. That's different from conclusions. Hypotheses require evidence to become conclusions. That's what the authorized assessment produced. You went into this engagement with a predetermined disposition toward finding wrongdoing. I went into this engagement with an open methodology and followed the evidence where it led. She kept her voice level. If the evidence had supported mismanagement or natural land degradation, I would have documented that. The evidence did not support those explanations. Carver changed direction several times, probing for inconsistency, and she followed each change without losing the thread. She'd been doing this kind of work for 5 years, and the thing she'd learned, the hard way, in her second year, when a developer's attorney had rattled her in a zoning dispute and her testimony had come out tangled, was that clarity was the only armor that actually worked. Not aggression, not defensiveness, just knowing what you knew and saying it plainly. Marcus Webb testified by video link, which Castillo had arranged after Grayson's team had twice tried to challenge his ability to appear in person. His testimony was the methodical kind that didn't make for dramatic watching, but that was difficult to effectively challenge. He walked through the compound identification, the lab protocols, the comparative analysis with prior cases, and the reasons that alternative contamination explanations were inconsistent with the specific chemistry found. When Grayson's attorneys tried to suggest that the compound might have come from adjacent agricultural operations, Marcus looked at the camera and said, with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone who should already know it, "This compound is not available in commercial agricultural products. It requires custom formulation. Its presence in the Ridge Hollow water system is not consistent with accidental contamination from standard farming operations. There is no adjacent operation in the county that would produce this specific chemical signature." The second attorney, the woman, whose name was Holloway, spent her portion of the questioning on the water rights notation, arguing that the survey language was standard protective language and that Harper had overinterpreted its significance. It was the weakest part of Grayson's countercase, and Holloway seemed to know it because she was faster there, less thorough, moving through it to get to her actual point. "Your expanded assessment went substantially beyond your engagement," Holloway said. "You began investigating third-party properties, tracing corporate registrations, contacting other landowners. This was not authorized agricultural consulting. This was an amateur investigation. My expanded scope authorization covered the full investigation of factors affecting the Ridge Hollow assessment, Harper said. Identifying a pattern of similar fraud affecting comparable properties is directly relevant to understanding what happened at Ridge Hollow. It's not amateur investigation, it's contextual analysis. You're not a fraud investigator. I'm an agricultural consultant who found evidence of agricultural fraud. I documented what I found and referred the legal dimensions to qualified legal counsel. She paused. That's exactly what I should have done. Holloway looked at her for a moment. Then she moved on. Danny Foss testified in the afternoon. He came in looking like a man walking into something he'd committed to before he was entirely sure he was capable of it. Jaw set, hands not quite steady, wearing a collared shirt that looked like it had been bought for the occasion and ironed by someone who cared that it was right. He sat down and looked at the room, and then he looked at Castillo, and she gave him a small nod, and he began. He was not a polished witness. He stumbled over some of the technical language, corrected himself twice on dates, and at one point lost his train of thought entirely for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. But he was honest in a way that was visible and that no amount of cross-examination styling could fully undercut. And when he described the first time he'd understood what the compound he was introducing into a drainage system actually did to the land and the animals that lived on it, the discomfort in his face was too specific and too textured to be performance. I told myself it was a soil treatment, he said. That's what I was told. Remediation work. I didn't look up the compound. I should have, but I didn't. I just did the work. He stopped. When I figured out what it actually was, I went home and I was sick. Physically sick. He looked at his hands on the table. I didn't do anything about it for 2 years. That's on me. I'm not here to say it isn't. Carver cross-examined him hard, going after the delay in coming forward, the financial relationship with Grayson's operation, the absence of documentation from Foss himself that corroborated his account. Foss answered each challenge without flinching and without escalating. He agreed that he'd been paid. He agreed that he hadn't come forward immediately. He did not agree that these things made his testimony false. I know what I did, Foss said at one point, when Carver pressed him on why anyone should believe a man who'd been complicit in the scheme he was now describing. I know what I saw. I know which properties I went to and what I put in the ground and what happened to those properties afterward. You can say I'm unreliable all you want. That doesn't change what I know. From the gallery, which had filled more than Harper had expected, there was a small sound, not quite a murmur. Dolores Hatch was in the third row, her daughter beside her. She was a small woman who sat very straight, and when Foss finished speaking, she was looking at him with an expression that contained more things than Harper could cleanly identify. The presiding officer, a woman named Judge Anita Reyes, efficient and sharp-eyed, who had said almost nothing during the testimony except to manage procedure, called a recess before issuing her preliminary ruling on the licensing challenge. During the recess, Cole found Harper in the hallway outside the hearing room. "How did it go?" he asked. "I don't know yet." She meant it. She'd done everything she could do, and the rest was out of her hands, which was the part of any proceeding she had always found hardest. Foss was good. He looked scared. He was scared. He told the truth anyway. Cole was quiet for a moment. He was looking through the glass panel in the hearing room door at the assembled people inside. Grayson's attorneys reviewing notes, Castillo organizing her documents, the gallery settling back after the recess break. "Grayson hasn't looked at me once today," he said. "Not once." "What does that tell you?" "That he knows exactly who I am and doesn't want to acknowledge it." A pause. "Men like that? They can run a scheme for years and never look the people they're hurting in the face. It makes it easier, I think, keeps it abstract." Harper looked through the glass panel at Grayson, who was speaking quietly with Carver and looking at a document. "Some people are better at that than others," she said. "The abstraction." "Does it ever stop?" Cole asked. "People like that, does it ever stop working for them?" "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes it stops." Judge Reyes's preliminary ruling came 40 minutes into the afternoon session. She dismissed the licensing challenge in its entirety, finding that Harper's methodology met professional standards and that the expanded scope authorization was properly documented. She further ruled that the evidentiary findings were admissible and that the contamination evidence, combined with the physical documentation of the modified drainage infrastructure, constituted sufficient basis for a full fraud investigation by the appropriate regulatory and law enforcement bodies. She then said something Harper hadn't expected, though Castillo's expression suggested she had. "The court is also concerned," Reyes said, with the careful phrasing of someone who means more than she is saying, "about the pattern of property assessments and corporate filings presented in these proceedings. The court will be referring this matter to the State Attorney General's office for review of potential systemic fraud affecting multiple agricultural properties." The room was quiet for a moment. Grayson's composed expression didn't change, but his lead attorney, Carver, wrote something quickly on his notepad and slid it across the table, and Grayson read it without looking up and then set it face down. In the gallery, Dolores Hatch reached over and took her daughter's hand. Cole was 2 seats down from Harper in the gallery, and when she glanced at him, he was looking at the front of the room with an expression she'd come to recognize. The particular stillness of a man absorbing something real. Not celebration. Something quieter than celebration. Something that was trying to recalibrate 6 years of a story he'd been telling himself about who he was and what he was worth. She looked back at the front of the room where Reyes was issuing procedural instructions for the record, and she let herself feel, briefly, carefully, the particular satisfaction of evidence that it held, of a thing built carefully enough that it didn't collapse when someone pushed it. It wasn't over. She knew that. The Attorney General referral would take time. The civil damages case would take longer. Victor Grayson had resources and attorneys and the institutional advantage of a man who had operated successfully for years and would not surrender any of it without a sustained fight. But the ruling had stood. The evidence was in the record. The names of 11 properties, now confirmed as 11 after Castillo's full review, were attached to a pattern that a court had acknowledged was worth investigating. That was enough for today. Outside the courthouse, in the flat Amarillo afternoon, the group of them stood in the parking lot without quite dispersing. Cole, Harper, Castillo, Jim Pardee, who had driven the 200 miles after all, and Dolores Hatch with her daughter. Dolores was smaller outside than she'd seemed inside, and when she shook Harper's hand, her grip was firm and her eyes were direct. "You didn't know us when you started this," she said. "You just looked at the land and saw it wasn't right." "The land told me," Harper said. "I just listened." Dolores nodded, then she looked at Cole. "My husband would have wanted to shake your hand," she said, "for not giving up." Cole accepted that without saying much, which was the right thing to do. There wasn't much to say to it. The afternoon light came at a low angle across the parking lot, and somewhere in the middle distance the Panhandle wind was doing what the Panhandle wind always did, which was blow steady and indifferent and carrying the smell of dry grass and open distance. Harper stood in it and felt the specific exhaustion of a day that had required everything she had, and underneath the exhaustion, something that wasn't quite relief, but was in the same neighborhood. The work wasn't done, but the work had held. The Attorney General's office moved faster than anyone had expected, which Castillo said was unusual, and which Harper suspected had something to do with the election cycle and a state AG who recognized a clean case when one landed on her desk. Within 3 weeks of the hearing, subpoenas had gone out to Grayson Land Services, to the Amarillo Law Office that had filed the shell company registrations, and to 2 banks that had processed the fraudulent loan instruments. Danny Foss had given a formal recorded statement that ran 4 hours and which Castillo described, after sitting through it, as comprehensive in the way that only genuinely guilty consciences tend to be. The fraud case built itself, in the way that well-documented cases sometimes do, each piece pulling the next into daylight. The chemical supplier who had formulated the compound was traced through purchase records and, when approached by investigators, cooperated immediately in the way that small operators tend to cooperate when they realize they've been the least protected participant in a larger scheme. 2 of Grayson's former employees gave statements. The Amarillo attorney who had set up the holding companies resigned from his firm and retained his own counsel. Victor Grayson held out longer than most people around him. He issued a public statement through his remaining attorney denying all allegations and characterizing the investigation as a politically motivated overreach. He appeared briefly at a county business association meeting that had been on his calendar for months, and the photographs from that event showed a man who had not yet adjusted his posture to match his circumstances, still composed, still projecting the careful authority of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room he entered. But the rooms were getting smaller. Harper was back at Ridge Hollow when the civil settlement offer came through. She'd returned 2 weeks after the hearing because the remediation work wasn't finished, and because she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge this, she wasn't ready to leave. She told Douglas she was completing the recovery assessment documentation, which was true. She didn't tell him the other part, because she wasn't entirely sure what the other part was yet. Cole handed her the phone across the kitchen table, where they'd had so many conversations by now that the chairs had developed a kind of assignment. Hers near the window, his with his back to the wall. She read the settlement terms on the screen and did the math in her head. "It covers the fraudulent debt," she said. "All 4 loan instruments with interest adjustments." She scrolled. "And there's a land remediation fund, enough to complete the soil and water treatment program properly." "Rita says there will be more," Cole said. "From the criminal restitution, when that resolves." "That'll take longer." She said a year, maybe 18 months. Harper set the phone down. Outside, the east pasture had been showing new grass growth for 2 weeks. Sparse, tentative, the pale green of something that had been underground waiting for conditions to change. The soil remediation was working, slowly. The contamination levels in the stock pond had dropped enough that Marcus had cleared it for gradual reintroduction once the water treatment was complete. The cattle in the north pasture had put on visible weight. Not enough weight, not yet, but the trajectory had reversed. "Are you going to take it?" she asked. "The settlement." Cole looked at the phone. "Rita recommends it. She says the civil case could run 2 more years, and the outcome wouldn't be substantially better." "She's probably right." "Yeah." He picked up his coffee. "I keep thinking I want to fight it all the way. Stand in front of a jury and make them hear all of it." He paused. "But that's about anger, not about the ranch. And the ranch needs the money now, not in 2 years. Harper looked at him. There was something in the way he'd said that. The self-awareness of it. The willingness to distinguish between what he wanted emotionally and what was actually right. That she recognized as a quality the man who'd met her at the porch 6 weeks ago hadn't quite had access to yet. Not because he'd been less intelligent then. Because he'd been buried. "Take the settlement," she said. He nodded slowly. "Yeah." The agreement was signed on a Thursday. That same week, the primary bank formally withdrew the foreclosure proceedings and restructured the remaining legitimate debt under terms that Castillo described as the best she'd seen a lender offer outside of a full forgiveness, which she attributed partly to the bank's own exposure. 2 of their loan officers had been in communication with Grayson's operation in ways that the AG's investigation was examining, and the bank had strong incentives to be cooperative with the ranchers their officers had helped defraud. Dolores Hatch's situation was resolved separately, but similarly. Jim Party's was more complicated. He had actually sold under duress, and the title had transferred. But the AG's office was pursuing a forced divestiture of properties acquired through fraud, and Castillo was cautiously optimistic about what that meant for Jim's chances of recovering something, if not the land itself, then at least a fair market value that hadn't been depressed by manufactured decline. Of the 11 properties Castillo had identified, 9 showed sufficient pattern similarity to be included in the civil action. The other 2 were murkier, with enough alternative explanations that she'd held them back rather than risk weakening the overall case. 7 of the 9 property owners were pursuing some form of recovery. It was not a clean sweep. It never was. Harper documented all of it. She built a final assessment report for Ridge Hollow that was longer and more detailed than any document she'd produced in her career. Not because length was the goal, but because the situation required completeness. She wanted every element of the fraud documented, every piece of the remediation plan specified, every projection for the ranch's recovery supported by data. It was, she thought, the most honest piece of work she'd ever done. partly because she'd cared about it in a way she didn't always let herself care about assignments. She'd started caring about it the moment she saw the inside-out pattern in the east pasture grass and understood that something had been done to this land deliberately, that the decline had not been random or earned. There was something about that, about seeing the evidence of a choice someone had made to destroy what another person had built, that had moved in her a particular kind of steadiness, not righteousness, something more practical. The certainty that the truth was findable if you looked carefully enough and didn't decide what it was before you found it. Her last full day at Ridge Hollow came on a Saturday in late October, when the light had changed from summer's flat blaze to the lower, cooler angle of fall. She spent the morning doing a final walk of the east pasture with her notebook, recording the grass recovery by section, photographing the drainage junction points, which had been professionally sealed by a licensed contractor 2 weeks prior. She walked the stock pond perimeter and took the last set of water samples that Marcus needed for his post-remediation report. She checked the cattle and made notes on body condition scores that were, for the first time, moving in a direction that made sense. Cole was fixing fence on the north line when she found him at midday, which was where she'd expected to find him. He was working a post that had heaved over the winter, the ground having frozen and thawed around it until it had tilted to the point of uselessness, and he was doing it the slow right way, digging out the base properly, resetting the post level, tamping the fill-in stages rather than all at once. He didn't rush it when she appeared. He finished the section he was on, then looked up. "You're walking the pasture," he said. "Final assessment walk." He looked at the east pasture, at the returning grass. "How's it look?" "Better than I projected at week 3. The north central section is ahead of schedule." She paused. "The south corner is slower. I've noted a modified protocol in the report for that zone. It'll need an additional treatment cycle in the spring." "I can do that." "I know you can." She'd written the protocol so that he could execute it himself or hire it done if he chose. Either way, it was manageable, not a dependency. He drove another stake into the ground, tamped the base. "When are you heading out?" "Tomorrow morning." He nodded, looking at the fence line. "You have something else lined up?" "Douglas has had 3 assessments on hold while I've been here. One in Wyoming, one in New Mexico." She paused. "I told him I needed a week before I took anything new." Cole looked at her. "A week's not much." "No," she agreed. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the grass. The same sound she'd heard on her first morning, or one just like it, carrying the same distance across the still air. She'd come to think of that sound as specific to this place, which was probably sentimental and not ornithologically accurate, but there it was. "I've been thinking about something," Cole said. He went back to the fence work, which she'd noticed was how he handled things he found difficult to say directly. He gave his hands something to do. "When I inherited this place, I thought I knew what I was supposed to do with it. Run cattle, hold the land, keep what my grandfather started from ending." He set the post level, checked it. "I did that for the first year, and it felt right. Then it started going wrong, and I kept trying to do the same things harder, as if the problem was effort." "It wasn't effort," she said. "No, but I didn't know that, so I pushed harder and watched it keep declining and started to think that the problem was me, that I didn't have what my grandfather had, what my father had." He tamped the fill with methodical strokes. "I almost sold 2 years ago, before Grayson made his offer. I almost sold to a different buyer, just to be done with it. The only reason I didn't was—" He stopped. "What stopped you?" He looked at the post. "Couldn't make myself sign. Every time I picked up the pen, I'd think about my grandfather's hands on this same fence line, and I'd put it back down." He shook his head. "Not rational." "Maybe not rational," Harper said, "but it kept the land in your hands long enough for someone to find what was actually wrong with it." He looked at her. "Someone showed up," he said. "Someone who looked at what everyone else had written off and decided the official story wasn't right." She didn't say anything for a moment. The wind came through the dry grass with that familiar sound, and she thought about the person she'd been when she'd stepped off the bus in the August heat, rolling a suitcase down an unpaved road toward a gate with a broken hinge. She'd been confident in her methodology and uncertain about almost everything else. Uncertain whether the job was worth the friction with Douglas. uncertain whether she'd find anything more than what the previous teams had found, uncertain, if she was being honest, whether she was the right person for this or just the person who'd argued hardest for the assignment. "I almost didn't take this one," she said. It was the first time she'd said that out loud. Cole raised his eyebrows slightly. "Why?" Douglas called it an exit assessment, said it was already decided. She looked at the fence line. "I have a habit of taking cases that other people have already concluded on. My supervisor calls it a personality defect." Sounds like a personality asset to me. "It's gotten me into trouble before." She paused. "Usually worth it." He smiled, not the small reluctant movements she'd seen in the early days, but a real one, the kind that reached his eyes. "I'd say it was worth it this time." That evening, Castillo called with the final confirmation of Grayson's plea agreement. He'd held out for 4 months after the AG's investigation formally opened, through 2 rounds of negotiation and 1 failed attempt to have the primary evidence suppressed, an attempt that the court had dismissed in 2 pages, citing the thoroughly documented methodology of the original assessment. In the end, the plea covered 12 counts of agricultural fraud, 2 counts of filing false instruments with the county recorder's office, and 1 count related to the chemical compound introduction that the state environmental agency had characterized, after their own review, as deliberate land contamination. He would lose his land holdings, including the properties acquired through the fraudulent scheme, which would be subject to the forced divestiture the AG had pursued. He would pay restitution into a fund administered by the court, distributed to the affected ranchers based on documented damages. He would not serve prison time, which was the part of the plea that Castillo had fought hardest against and lost, and which she mentioned with the particular flatness of a lawyer who has been in this business long enough to know that outcomes are never entirely satisfying. "He'll lose everything he spent a decade building," Castillo said. "In this county, that's probably worse than prison for a man like him." Harper wasn't sure that was true, but she didn't argue it. "The restitution fund is structured to allow partial recovery of property value for ranchers who were forced to sell," Castillo continued. "It won't make everyone whole. Nothing will make Dolores Hatch whole. But it's real money distributed to real people who had real things taken from them." "How is she?" Harper asked. "Dolores, she's—" Castillo paused in a way that suggested she was choosing words. "She said she's glad she lived long enough to see it. That's what she said. Not that she was happy, just glad." Harper stayed on the porch after the call ended in the cold October dark, with the ranch house lit behind her and the sounds of night settling over the land. The windmill turned in the distance, its rhythm steady and ordinary. The sound it made different now that the bearing was right. No longer a grinding catch and release, but a smooth rotation that you could listen to without waiting for the failure. Small things. They accumulated. She thought about what she believed, sitting there. Not what she knew professionally, but what she actually believed about the way things worked. She'd spent 5 years in this field, watching land and the people who tried to hold on to it, and what she'd come to understand was that the land itself didn't care about any of it. The soil contaminated, the grass died, the water ran wherever gravity and pipe systems directed it, indifferent to who owned the title or what they deserved. Land didn't reward virtue or punish failure. It just responded to what was done to it. What mattered was who was paying attention, who was willing to look at something everyone else had already walked away from and ask whether the official explanation was actually true. That was the thing she couldn't teach anyone. She'd tried, twice, with junior consultants who had the technical skills, and couldn't quite develop the other part. The willingness to sit with a question long enough that the answer formed on its own terms rather than yours. The door opened behind her and Cole came out with 2 mugs. He handed her one and leaned against the porch rail, looking out at the dark land. "Castillo called you too?" she said. "Yeah." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "It's done then. Mostly. The restitution distribution will take time. Jim Party's divestiture case could run another year. But for this place, for Ridge Hollow. For this place, yes." She looked out at the dark. "It's done." He was quiet for a while. When he spoke, his voice had the particular quality of someone saying something they've been working up to. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly." "Okay." "When you came here, In those first 2 days, before you found the junctions, before the lab results, when it was just observations and a bad feeling. He paused. Did you know? Did you know something was wrong, or were you just following the methodology? She thought about that honestly. Both, she said finally. The methodology told me the pattern didn't fit the explanation, but there was something else, something I couldn't have put in a report. The barn. She paused. The barn was too well kept. Someone who was failing because of their own mismanagement. They either fight everything at once and neglect the details, or they give up on everything, including the details. You'd kept the barn. The files were organized. You were still showing up every morning and doing the work exactly right, even when the results were wrong. She looked at him. That's not what failure looks like from the inside. That's what sabotage looks like from the inside. He was quiet for a long moment. I didn't think anyone could see that. The barn told me before anything else did. He looked out at the dark ranch, at the land he'd spent 6 years watching decline, and the past 6 weeks watching, slowly, incrementally, begin to reverse. The cattle were shadows in the north pasture. The grass in the east was coming back, not fast enough to be visible in the dark, but it was there, doing what it needed to do without anyone watching. Stay through the spring, he said. It wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite a request. The South Corner treatment cycle. You said it needs a modified protocol. I'd rather do it with someone who knows what they're looking at. Cole, I know you have other assignments. I know Douglas has things on hold. He paused. I'm not asking you to give up your work. I'm asking you to consider that this might be part of it. She looked at him. The thing about Cole Mercer was that he said exactly what he meant and didn't embellish it. And that quality, which had seemed like closed-off reticence on the first day, had turned out to be something closer to its opposite. He just didn't say anything he didn't mean. She thought about the Wyoming assessment, the New Mexico one, the careful, bounded professional life she'd built over 5 years of moving from one failing operation to the next, fixing what she could fix, documenting what she couldn't, and leaving. She thought about the east pasture grass coming back pale and tentative from contaminated ground, and about how the spring treatment would determine whether the South Corner recovered fully or stayed a problem zone, and about how there were things you could only know by being present for them, by watching the process unfold in real time rather than reading about it in a report. Through the spring, she said, for the South Corner. He nodded. He didn't oversell it, didn't push further, just accepted what she'd offered and let it be what it was. The night was cold, and the stars over the panhandle were the particular density of stars you only see when there's nothing between you and them. No city glow, no cloud cover, just distance and clarity. They stood on the porch of a ranch that had almost ceased to exist and didn't, drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm, and the windmill turned in the dark, and the cattle were somewhere in the grass, and the land was doing, underneath its damaged surface, the slow, patient work of recovery. There was something Harper had learned, was still learning, about the difference between saving something and restoring it. Saving was fast and dramatic, the intervention that stopped the bleeding. Restoration was slower and less visible and required a different kind of faith. The faith that if you corrected what had been done wrong and gave the damaged thing time and the right conditions, it would do the rest itself. That the capacity was still there, underneath the damage, waiting. That was true of land. She'd come to believe it was true of people too. Not always. She wasn't naive enough to believe it always. Some damage went too deep, some window closed too long before anyone looked. But here, on this particular ranch, with this particular man who had kept his barn clean for 6 years while everything else declined, who had held the pen above the sale documents and put it down again without being able to say exactly why, here the capacity had survived. It just needed someone to look at it right. She finished her coffee. The windmill turned. Somewhere in the east pasture, in the dark, the grass was growing.